My mother-in-law called me a freeloader maid at a dinner party, so I walked out and then.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Do you think you can come into this house and do whatever you please? Elizabeth's cold and contemptuous voice rang out, striking Ellen like a harsh slap. Ellen lowered her head, trying to suppress her trembling, but the feeling of being oppressed and belittled overwhelmed her. From the very first day she set foot in this house, not once had she heard a kind word from her mother-in-law. Andrew, do you have anything to say? Ellen turned to her husband, hoping to find a shred of support, but his gaze avoided hers, entirely siding with his mother. Since their marriage, Andrew had always ignored Elizabeth's attitude, sometimes even subtly supporting her as if to prove his filial piety. Elizabeth crossed her arms over her chest, her smile dripping with mockery. Ellen, I have no obligation to tolerate your incompetence. You need to understand clearly that this family has high standards, and you will never measure up. Ellen stood silently, her eyes red with suppressed anger. She wanted to scream, to retort, but the fear and wounded pride kept her silent. She looked at Elizabeth, filled with indignation. This woman treated her as nothing more than a servant, and her harsh words cut like a knife deep into her heart. What are you still standing there for? Didn't you hear me talking to you? Elizabeth snapped, startling Ellen. Go clean the living room immediately. Guests will arrive in 30 minutes. Don't let me see a single speck of dust. Ellen simply nodded, the oppressive feeling rendering her unable to say anything else. She slowly walked toward the living room, tears welling up. She wondered if marrying into this family had been the biggest mistake of her life. At that moment, a maid named Caroline, one of the few people in the house who offered her any comfort, approached. Caroline spoke softly. Don't be upset, Ellen. Your mother-in-law just wants to assert her power, and you're a thorn in her side. Ellen managed a sad smile, finding some solace in Caroline's words. Thank you, Caroline. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't know who to talk to. Before they could say more, the sound of Elizabeth's heels clicking sharply on the floor approached, making Ellen feel as if she were about to be judged. Caroline, are you standing here gossiping instead of working? Elizabeth's cold voice broke the moment. And you, Ellen, didn't I tell you to clean the living room? Why are you still standing here? Ellen hurriedly walked away, not daring to look back. She knew that any action on her part could be used as another excuse for Elizabeth's criticism. On her way to the living room, she caught glimpses of the curious yet avoiding eyes of others in the house. They were fully aware of her predicament but dared not intervene. A little later, as Ellen knelt to clean the floor, Elizabeth entered, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scrutinizing every movement. What are you doing? Don't you even know how to mop the floor? You're completely useless. Elizabeth spat, her voice dripping with disdain. Ellen clenched her lips tightly, her hands gripping the mop so hard that her fingers turned white. She wanted to fight back, to scream at this woman, but she knew she had no power. In this house, Elizabeth was the ruler, and she was merely a weak, despised figure. Not stopping there, Elizabeth continued. I still can't understand why my son married someone as useless as you. Someone with no career, no wealth, and who can't even be a proper wife. You can't even mop a floor right. Ellen couldn't take it anymore. She looked up, her voice trembling with pent-up anger. You can hate me, but I still have my dignity. Don't treat me like a lowly nobody. Elizabeth laughed, her icy laugh sending chills down Ellen's spine. Dignity? Do you think you can have dignity in this house? You're an outsider here, and I will never accept you. Their conversation was cut short when Andrew walked in. Ellen turned to her husband, struggling to maintain her composure, hoping he would take her side. But Andrew merely frowned, looking at her as though she were a burden. What trouble are you causing now, Ellen? A wave of disappointment and betrayal surged through Ellen's heart. She wanted to yell at him, to ask if he had completely fallen under his mother's influence, but his indifferent gaze silenced her. All she could do was stand there, bitterly looking at the man she had once trusted and loved. Elizabeth observed the scene, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. "See, Andrew. I told you from the beginning, this girl doesn't belong in our family." Andrew sighed and turned away without saying another word. Ellen felt trapped in a cycle with no escape, and every time she tried to rise, those around her pushed her down even further. From Elizabeth to her own husband, they all seemed united in treating her as if she were worthless, undeserving of a place in this family. She suppressed her anger and walked away, but inside her, a flame of resentment burned fiercely. Ellen swore to herself that one day, she would no longer allow herself to be treated this way. Later, Ellen sat alone in her room, staring at the bruises on her arm from Elizabeth's forceful shove. She had dropped a glass while washing dishes, and Elizabeth hadn't hesitated to push her violently against the counter, accompanied by scathing words. Slumped on the floor, she kept asking herself why things had turned out this way. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Caroline slipped in, her eyes full of concern. "Ellen, I saw, do you need help?" Ellen looked at Caroline, her eyes filled with despair. "Caroline, have you ever felt trapped? Like everything is against you?" Caroline sat down beside her, holding Ellen's hand. "You can trust me. Your mother-in-law, she never accepts anyone unless they completely submit to her will. You're not the first to suffer, and I'm afraid you won't be the last." Ellen closed her eyes, fighting back tears. Do you think Andrew will ever stand by me one day?" Caroline shook her head, looking at Ellen with pity. "She gave birth to him, and he will always take her side. Don't put too much hope in that, Ellen." At that moment, the door to the room suddenly opened. Elizabeth stood there, her sharp gaze cutting like a knife. "Caroline, are you here again? Don't you understand that your job is downstairs, not up here chatting?" Caroline quickly stood up, bowed her head, and hurried out. Ellen was left alone to face Elizabeth, the overwhelming fear eclipsing all her thoughts. Elizabeth stepped in, sat down on a chair, and crossed her arms, looking at Ellen with icy eyes. "Do you think you can talk to the servants to create alliances in this house?" "Wake up, Ellen," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with disdain. Ellen felt anger bubbling up inside her, but she held it back, not daring to resist. Elizabeth looked at her triumphantly, as if she knew there was no way for Ellen to fight back. "And don't think Andrew will defend you. He's been with me since he was born, and he understands the value of family. He will never give that up for an outsider like you." Elizabeth stood up and patted Ellen on the shoulder, but the gesture felt more like a cold warning. As Elizabeth left the room, Ellen felt as though she was about to break apart. She wanted to scream, to run away from this place, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Over the past few days, Elizabeth had gradually taken control of every aspect of her life, from contacting friends to her personal expenses. Even her phone had been taken by Elizabeth under the pretense of being unnecessary. That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Elizabeth continued her cruel game. "Ellen, I heard you broke a glass today. Do you ever think about the consequences of destroying property in this house?" Ellen kept her head down, not wanting to respond. But Elizabeth didn't stop there. "You not only fail as a wife but also don't know how to take care of your husband's property. Andrew, do you think marrying her was a mistake?" Elizabeth turned to her son, her face full of ridicule. Andrew remained silent, but his silence hurt Ellen more than any words could. She looked at her husband but saw no trace of affection in his eyes. It was only the gaze of a man completely indifferent, uncaring about her pain. Ellen bit her lip, clenching her fists to stay calm, but the humiliation was impossible to hide. She felt as if she were drowning in a bottomless sea of sorrow. At that moment, Tomas, her usually quiet father-in-law, who had been silent since the meal began, suddenly spoke, though his words only added fuel to the fire. "Perhaps Ellen needs to learn to respect others and understand her place in this family. Ellen looked up at Tomas, feeling as if she had been pushed even deeper into despair. The man she had thought might at least remain neutral was no different from Elizabeth, only more discreet and less overt. The dinner ended in heavy silence, with all eyes focused on Ellen as if she were an unwelcome intruder. She felt surrounded, with no escape. When she returned to her room, her heart ached, a stifling, burning resentment filling every part of her being. She sat on her bed, unable to stop replaying the painful words Elizabeth and Tomas had hurled at her. Every hope she had for a family and a happy marriage seemed to crumble into ashes. She wondered if she deserved all this suffering. That night, Ellen could hardly sleep. Tears kept streaming down her face, and she promised herself that one day, she would find a way to escape this nightmare. But for now, all she could do was close her eyes and endure in silence. The next morning, Ellen woke up with swollen eyes from a sleepless night. She slowly made her way downstairs, the weight of exhaustion and sadness heavy on her shoulders. As she was preparing breakfast, Elizabeth appeared out of nowhere, her sharp eyes fixed on her. "You can still sleep in until this hour?" Elizabeth said mockingly. "I can't believe my son married such a lazy woman. Now hurry up and set the table. I don't have time to wait for someone as slow as you." Ellen tried to stay calm, but inside, every word Elizabeth spoke felt like a dagger to her soul. She quietly followed orders, saying nothing, knowing that any reaction could give Elizabeth more ammunition to hurt her. While Ellen was setting the table for breakfast, Andrew walked in, but his eyes were completely unfocused, as if he didn't see what was happening. Ellen looked at her husband, hoping he would take her side, just this once. But as always, Andrew simply sat down indifferently, paying no attention to her pained expression. Elizabeth noticed this and was clearly pleased, as if she had just won a victory. She walked over, placed a hand on Andrew's shoulder, and smiled sweetly. "You see, Andrew, I only want what's best for you. You deserve a wife who knows how to take care of the family, not someone like her." Andrew only nodded slightly, saying nothing more. Ellen felt her heart being crushed. She stood there, feeling as if she had become invisible in the very house that was supposed to be her home. At that moment, a family friend, Rosa, visited. Rosa was a woman in her 50s who always dressed elegantly and often dropped by to chat with Elizabeth about life's matters. When she saw Ellen, Rosa couldn't hide her surprise. "Oh, Elizabeth, is this your daughter-in-law? I thought she was the new maid." Rosa chuckled, completely oblivious to her rudeness. "She doesn't look like someone fit to be the daughter-in-law of a family as noble as yours." Elizabeth laughed loudly, casting a contemptuous glance at Ellen. "She's not much different from a maid, Rosa. Except, I doubt anyone would hire her as one, she's far too clumsy." Ellen stood there, trying to suppress her emotions, but the piercing gazes of Rosa and Elizabeth made her feel as though she was trapped between two raging flames of hatred. She wanted to run away, but her legs felt as if they were nailed to the floor, unable to move. Rosa continued. "Andrew, you are truly filial to accept your mother's authority like this. Not every man would allow his mother to manage his household like you do. Your mother is indeed a strong woman." Elizabeth laughed loudly, clearly proud. "That's right, I only do what's best for my son. As for others in this house, all they need to do is follow orders." Ellen couldn't take it anymore. She took a deep breath and then spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "Mrs. Rosa, I am Andrew's wife, and I expect you to respect that." Rosa raised her eyebrows, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. She turned to Elizabeth, her face full of mockery. "Elizabeth, it seems your daughter-in-law needs some lessons in proper behavior." Elizabeth nodded in agreement, smiling maliciously. "Perhaps you need to remember, Ellen, that this is my house, and you have no right to demand respect from anyone. You are a guest here, Ellen, never forget that." Ellen said nothing more, her tears threatening to spill over. She turned and walked back to her room, closing the door behind her. She couldn't understand how Andrew could remain silent, allowing his mother and her friends to humiliate her like this. In that moment, Ellen felt as if everything was crumbling. A few hours later, Caroline slipped quietly into her room, carrying a towel and a glass of water. "Ellen, don't be upset. Elizabeth may be a mother, but she's not a good person." Ellen only shook her head, unable to speak. She felt completely drained, with no strength left to fight back or defend herself. Caroline sat down beside her, her gaze full of sympathy and sadness. "You have to be strong, Ellen. Maybe one day, things will change," Caroline said softly, offering a fragile glimmer of hope. Ellen gave a faint, sad smile. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this situation. Everyone around her, from her mother-in-law and her friends to her own husband, seemed united in pushing her to the edge. She felt as if she were living in an invisible prison, surrounded by contempt, scorn, and constant criticism. When Caroline left the room, Ellen remained alone, enveloped in the thick darkness of despair. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the mocking laughter and harsh words still echoing in her mind. That night, after yet another tense dinner, Ellen cleaned up the dishes as quickly as she could to avoid giving Elizabeth any more reasons to complain. As she was washing the plates, Elizabeth suddenly appeared, leaning against the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, her eyes full of scrutiny. "How long do you plan to keep hiding?" Elizabeth asked, her tone sharp. Ellen turned around, confused by her words. "Hiding from what, Mother?" Ellen replied, trying to stay calm. Elizabeth smirked with disdain. "Do you think I don't know? Are you planning to let this family live in the mess and filth you create? If you won't take care of this house, at the very least, you should learn how to keep it clean." Ellen clenched her hands tightly to contain her anger. "I always try my best to keep the house clean and to do my part, Mother." Elizabeth laughed loudly, the sound slicing through Ellen's pride like a blade. "Your best? Do you really think what you're doing is good enough? It's laughable that someone like you believes you can take care of this family. But remember, this is my house, and you're just a freeloader here." Ellen couldn't hold back anymore. "I am Andrew's wife, and I have a right to be here. This is not just your house." Elizabeth stared at her, her eyes icy. "A right to be here? Are you joking? Your only right here is to obey me and serve this family, understand? Andrew may be your husband, but his heart belongs to his mother. You are nothing but an obstacle." Ellen felt as if she were being pushed into an endless abyss, surrounded by sneers and ultimate contempt. Elizabeth's harsh words cut deeper than ever. Elizabeth continued, relentless. "Tomorrow, I'll be hosting a tea party for some friends, and I want this house to be perfect. I don't want to see any trace of the laziness you usually display. If you can't manage that, perhaps you should reconsider your place here." Ellen said nothing more, simply nodded quietly, and turned back to washing the dishes. She couldn't understand why Elizabeth hated her so much. No matter how hard she tried, every effort seemed meaningless in the eyes of her domineering mother-in-law. The next morning, just as Elizabeth had said, the house was full of guests. Her friends, mostly wealthy women, were dressed elegantly and constantly exchanged trivial gossip. Elizabeth proudly showed off everything in the house, from her collection of fine porcelain to the silk rug she had recently purchased. Ellen stayed in the kitchen, quietly preparing tea and pastries for the party, but she couldn't escape the disdainful laughter from the women in the living room. "And who is your mother, Ellen?" One of them, Mrs. Diane, asked, feigning interest but clearly intending to provoke. "If I'm not mistaken, your family isn't particularly notable, is it?" Elizabeth laughed, patting Diane on the shoulder. "That's right, Diane. Her family is nothing to speak of. Just a small, middle-class family with nothing worth mentioning." Ellen bit her lip hard, trying to suppress the surge of humiliation rising within her. She quietly brought the tea and pastries out to the ladies, doing her best to mask her emotions. Yet their eyes looked at her as if she were a servant, not the daughter-in-law of the family. Mrs. Rosa, Elizabeth's friend, laughed maliciously as she looked at Ellen. "She looks more like a maid than a daughter-in-law, doesn't she, Elizabeth? How could someone so unkempt be part of this family?" Ellen gripped the tray of tea so tightly her hands turned white. She wanted to respond, to defend her dignity, but the contemptuous gazes of Elizabeth and her friends made her feel trapped, as if she were surrounded by an inescapable wall of disdain. Andrew walked in, seeing Ellen bowing her head and enduring the insults. Instead of standing by her or defending her, he sighed and walked over to his mother, engaging her in conversation with concern. Elizabeth took her son's hand, her expression brimming with pride and satisfaction. "Look at this, Andrew. Did you make the right choice in a wife? A woman who is utterly unworthy of our family." Andrew didn't reply, simply remaining silent in agreement. This silence made Ellen feel completely abandoned. The man she loved and trusted the most had turned his back on her, leaving her to endure his mother's cruelty alone. Mrs. Rosa continued to laugh, looking at Ellen with pity. "Ellen, have you ever thought that you don't belong here? Someone like you should find a place that suits you better, perhaps in a maid's quarters." Ellen turned away, unwilling to look any longer. She returned to the kitchen, her heart shattered and her pride crushed. She wondered why she had to endure all of this. Yet, a tiny glimmer of hope remained in her heart, a hope that one day she might escape this living hell. The next day, as Ellen prepared to leave the house to buy groceries for the family, Elizabeth blocked her way at the door. She looked Ellen up and down, her eyes filled with undisguised contempt. "Where do you think you're going?" Elizabeth asked coldly. "I'm just going to buy a few things for dinner, as you requested," Ellen replied, trying to keep her voice calm. Elizabeth crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "Shopping? And how much money do you plan to waste this time? Haven't you spent enough already?" Ellen was taken aback. "I'm only buying what's necessary, everything on the list you gave me." "Don't play innocent with me, Ellen," Elizabeth interrupted, her tone dripping with disdain. "Do you think I don't know? You're trying to take advantage of this family, wasting money on frivolous things. Do you think I haven't noticed?" Ellen couldn't believe her ears. Since the day she entered this house, every expense had been tightly controlled by Elizabeth, leaving her no opportunity to spend on anything outside of what Elizabeth dictated. And now, Elizabeth was blatantly accusing her of extravagance. "Mother, I'm not. I'm only doing what you've asked," Ellen tried to explain, but Elizabeth shook her head, her sharp eyes cutting through Ellen like a blade. "Enough talking. I won't let you go anywhere. From now on, Caroline will handle the shopping and meal preparation. Your job is to stay home and clean, understand?" Anger boiled within Ellen. She had done everything she could to meet Elizabeth's demands, yet nothing was ever enough. And now, Elizabeth was taking away her freedom to even leave the house, reducing her to a prisoner in her own home. She wanted to protest, to scream, but Elizabeth's cruel gaze forced her to suppress her feelings. Ellen simply nodded, feeling as though she had nothing left to lose. "Good. Now get back inside. And remember, I'm always watching you," Elizabeth said before turning away, leaving Ellen standing frozen in the living room, feeling as though she were nailed to the floor. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Elizabeth continued her psychological assault. "Today, I had to work so hard to keep the family's finances in check. Some people always find ways to take advantage of our generosity." Andrew nodded in agreement, offering no objection. Ellen sat silently, looking at her husband, but he refused to meet her pleading gaze. She no longer knew what to do to make him understand the pain she was going through. "Some people seem to think that just because they carry the title of daughter-in-law in this family, they can do whatever they want," Elizabeth continued, her voice full of disdain. "But they're mistaken. This house has rules, and I won't let anyone break them." The meal passed in heavy silence, with each of Elizabeth's words cutting deeper into Ellen's heart like a knife. She felt like a worthless outsider, with no voice or rights in this family. After dinner, as everyone left the table, Elizabeth unexpectedly stopped Ellen. "Tomorrow, I'm hosting an important gathering with friends. I want you to prepare everything, from cleaning the house to preparing the meal, and don't disappoint me." Ellen nodded, feeling as though she were being swallowed whole by Elizabeth's unreasonable demands. Even the household staff didn't have to endure the relentless pressure and impossible standards imposed on her. That night, Ellen barely slept, worrying about the tasks she needed to complete the next day and how she could possibly please Elizabeth, even though she knew all her efforts would be in vain. The next morning, at the crack of dawn, Ellen began her work. She cleaned every corner of the house, meticulously checking every detail to ensure Elizabeth wouldn't find anything to criticize. By noon, she started preparing the meal for Elizabeth's gathering. The intricate and elaborate dishes Elizabeth demanded required her to work non-stop, leaving no time to rest. Elizabeth appeared in the kitchen, her eyes scanning Ellen with disdain. "You're so slow. When do you think you'll finish?" Ellen tried to stay calm. "I've prepared most of the dishes, Mother. I'll finish as quickly as I can." Elizabeth smirked, her expression full of contempt. "As quickly as you can? At this rate, I don't know when there will be a decent meal on the table. You're utterly useless." Ellen didn't respond, silently continuing her work. She was too exhausted, physically and emotionally, to argue or defend herself. All that remained within her was a profound sense of helplessness and despair. When Elizabeth's gathering began, Ellen became a shadow in the house, quietly bringing food to the ladies while they whispered and chuckled behind her back. Every time she passed, she could hear their mocking comments about her, her marriage, and her supposed unworthiness to be part of the family. "Poor Andrew," one of the ladies murmured. "He has to endure a wife like that. If it were me, I couldn't bear it." Ellen's face burned with shame, but she forced herself to hold it in. She couldn't respond, couldn't walk away, and couldn't show her emotions. All she could do was continue enduring, continuing to serve like a servant no one respected. At the end of the gathering, Elizabeth looked at her with a mocking expression. "You managed to get through that, Ellen. But don't think I'm impressed. This is your responsibility, and I never expect less." Ellen simply nodded, saying nothing. She felt as if pieces of herself were breaking apart, as if every shred of hope was disappearing in this endless nightmare. After the gathering, Elizabeth called Ellen into the living room. She sat in the grand chair, exuding authority and arrogance, holding a teacup, her expression cold and distant. "Sit down, Ellen," Elizabeth said in an icy tone. Ellen reluctantly sat in the chair opposite her, a sense of unease rising within her. She didn't know what Elizabeth intended this time, but fear and exhaustion had drained her to the point where she felt almost powerless. Elizabeth stared at her for a long time, as if scrutinizing every expression on her face, before speaking slowly. "You know, Ellen, you're the greatest disappointment this family has ever had. Since the moment you stepped into this house, you haven't done a single thing right." Ellen clenched her hands tightly, trying to stay calm. She knew reacting would only make things worse, but Elizabeth's cruel words felt like knives cutting into her heart. Elizabeth sipped her tea before continuing. "We expected so much from you. I thought you'd be an obedient wife, someone who could build a family, but you've completely failed. You can't even get the simplest things right." Ellen looked down, feeling tears welling up. She had done everything she could, worked tirelessly to meet Elizabeth's demands, but it never seemed to be enough. She was constantly judged, criticized, and belittled, even when she had done nothing wrong. Seeing Ellen's weakness, Elizabeth smiled with contempt. "I've told Andrew many times that he deserves someone better. Someone who can bring value to this family, not someone useless and incapable of standing on her own 2 feet." Ellen wanted to stand up, to speak out, to defend herself, but she felt paralyzed. In this house, she was like a caged bird with no voice, no freedom, and no one on her side. Suddenly, Elizabeth set her teacup down, her gaze turning sharper. "One more thing, Ellen. I don't want to see you meeting with anyone outside this family, especially Diana." Ellen looked up in surprise. Diana was a neighbor she had recently befriended, one of the few people who had shown her kindness. But Diana is just a friend. She's never done anything wrong. Elizabeth sneered. "A friend? Do you think you deserve friends? You have no right to associate with anyone outside this family. I won't allow you to bring shame to us by mingling with lowly people." Ellen clenched her fists, anger rising within her. "Diana is kind. She's the only one who supported and comforted me when—" "You have no right to talk to me about support or comfort," Elizabeth interrupted, her tone dripping with disdain. "My family doesn't need pity from the likes of Diana, and we certainly don't need excuses from you." Ellen stared at Elizabeth, her heart burning with anger and helplessness. She had long realized that nothing would ever satisfy Elizabeth. All Elizabeth wanted was control, to dominate and crush her completely. As Ellen prepared to stand up, Andrew unexpectedly walked into the room. He noticed the tension between the two women but simply stood there, saying nothing. Ellen looked at her husband, her eyes pleading with him to speak up, hoping he would defend her. But Andrew just stood still, his expression cold and indifferent. Elizabeth seized the opportunity to attack further. "Andrew, I've told you many times that Ellen doesn't belong in this family. She's not worthy of you, and she'll never be the person you need." Andrew nodded slightly, his expression void of emotion, as if everything Elizabeth said were true. Ellen felt her heart shatter. She wanted to cry, to scream, but there was no one here to listen or understand her pain. Seeing Ellen's pained expression, Elizabeth seemed cruelly satisfied. She stepped closer to Ellen and whispered, "You should reconsider your place here. Because perhaps one day, you won't be welcome in this house anymore." Ellen froze, feeling as though she had been pushed into a pit of despair. Every word Elizabeth spoke felt like a heavy blow, drowning her in loneliness and helplessness. As Elizabeth and Andrew left the room, Ellen sat there alone, unsure of what to do next. She felt as though everything was against her. She was trapped in a house that should have been a safe haven but had become a hell filled with cold, cruel people. Caroline walked by and noticed Ellen sitting quietly with a vacant expression. She approached her. "Ellen, are you okay?" Ellen didn't answer, only stared ahead with empty eyes. She didn't know how much longer she could endure, but deep down, a small flame of resistance began to burn. She knew she couldn't live like this forever. Tonight, she would leave. Elizabeth never expected that her days of dominance in the grand mansion would soon come to an end. Just a few months after Ellen decided to leave, Elizabeth's life began to unravel. Her relationship with her son, Andrew, grew increasingly distant. Without Ellen to blame and criticize, Elizabeth realized that her presence had become dull and exhausting for Andrew. The way she had manipulated and controlled Ellen no longer held a place in her son's heart, the son she once believed would always stand by her. Andrew, once an obedient son, began to feel the void Ellen had left in his life. Dinner became quieter, and the house seemed to lose its warmth. He noticed her absence in every meal, in every laughter she once tried to create despite enduring humiliation. He started to realize that the deafening silence was a silent punishment he had to bear. There was no one to share his worries with, no one to offer him a gentle smile or a loving glance as she used to. But by then, Andrew could do nothing but bow his head and accept that what he was experiencing was just the beginning of the price he had to pay. Elizabeth was not spared from the consequences either. Her friends gradually distanced themselves after learning that Ellen had left, as Ellen was the reason many women from high society visited Elizabeth. They came to indulge in Elizabeth's sharp remarks about her unfortunate daughter-in-law, to witness her influence and power over someone else. But with Ellen gone, there was no one left for Elizabeth to mock, and no one was interested in hearing her boast about her family anymore. Worse still, rumors about Elizabeth's harsh treatment of her daughter-in-law spread everywhere. Those who once respected her no longer admired her. Instead, she faced pitying looks and judgmental glances from people she had once looked down upon. Elizabeth began to feel isolated, gradually losing the position of authority she had once held. Meanwhile, Ellen began to settle into her new life. She started working at a charity organization, where she experienced empathy and respect from those around her. Unlike the cold, oppressive house of Elizabeth and Andrew, where she had always felt like an outsider, Ellen now found herself able to breathe freely and live authentically. She also made good friends, colleagues who were willing to listen and support her when she needed it. Ellen began to rediscover her self-worth and her identity. With each passing day, she grew more confident and strong, no longer the weak woman who had been crushed by relentless criticism. As time went on, Elizabeth realized that she wasn't just losing influence over those around her but was also losing control over her son. Andrew, once her loyal and obedient child, became colder and more withdrawn. He no longer sought her out for conversation or advice and even started avoiding her long-winded, domineering talks. Whenever they sat together, Andrew would remain silent, staring off into the distance with his mind seemingly elsewhere. One day, Elizabeth caught Andrew looking at the wedding photo of him and Ellen, his eyes filled with sadness. It was the only photo left, as Elizabeth had demanded that everything related to Ellen be discarded when she left. But Andrew had kept that photo, perhaps because it was the only remaining evidence of a marriage he had abandoned and let crumble. Elizabeth couldn't bear seeing the regret in her son's eyes, as it confirmed that Andrew was blaming himself for losing the wife he once loved. For Elizabeth, each day in the now empty house became a nightmare. With no one left to lash out at or assert her authority over, she began to feel an uncomfortable loneliness. Even the household staff started leaving her, including Caroline, who had stayed loyal for so long. Elizabeth couldn't stomach the idea that a servant she had once looked down on could dare to quit her job, but when Caroline left, Elizabeth was forced to confront the reality that she had no one left by her side. Andrew, meanwhile, faced difficulties at work. Colleagues and business partners who had once respected him began to change their attitudes. Rumors about how he had treated his wife and his mother's cruelty toward Ellen spread widely. Andrew began to feel the distance and lack of goodwill from those around him. Once, a colleague asked him pointedly, "Andrew, I heard you once had a very devoted wife. Do you think you've lost the most valuable thing in your life?" The question left him silent, unsure of how to respond. Everything he had once thought was stable in his life now seemed to crumble before his eyes. When Ellen was with him, he had taken everything for granted, assuming she would always be there to endure and uphold the family. But now that she was gone, he realized that it had been her quiet perseverance and endurance that brought peace to the household, a peace he had failed to appreciate. Without Ellen, the house was now filled only with dark silence and an emptiness he couldn't fill. Meanwhile, Ellen's life began to brighten. She met a kind man named James, a colleague at the charity organization. James wasn't just a good friend but someone who was always willing to listen and share her burdens. He never imposed on her or criticized her for her past, nor did he judge her for what she had endured. James admired her for who she was, a strong, compassionate woman who always gave her best to help others. With James, Ellen gradually rediscovered joy and meaning in her life. She realized that happiness didn't come from what others gave her but from her own freedom and the ability to live authentically. On weekends, they participated in charity activities together, helping those in need and connecting with like-minded people. Each time she saw James's smile, Ellen felt a sense of lightness and peace, a feeling she once thought she would never experience again after her painful past. A few months later, Elizabeth began to feel the full weight of her loneliness and loss. One day, as she sat alone in the vast living room, she looked around and realized that everything she had worked so hard to maintain and control now held no meaning. Every item in the house, every detail she had once boasted about, now felt cold and lifeless, no longer bringing her the pride they once did. She looked down at her hands, hands that had once gripped the reins of power in the family, and suddenly understood that she had lost something far more important, the respect and affection of those around her. One evening, Andrew unexpectedly told his mother that he wanted to leave the house and live on his own. He could no longer endure the suffocating atmosphere of this home, filled with painful memories and unreasonable criticisms. Despite Elizabeth's attempts to convince him to stay, Andrew was resolute. He looked at her, his eyes devoid of the respect of a son and filled instead with profound disappointment. "Mother," Andrew said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Do you realize that you're the reason my life has turned out this way? I lost a good wife, someone I truly loved, because you couldn't let go of your need to control everything." Elizabeth was stunned, unable to believe that the son she had loved so much would say such things to her. She tried to find excuses to justify herself, but Andrew stood up without another word and left the house. The home was now empty, leaving her alone with the hollow sounds of isolation and a loneliness so unbearable it began to consume her. While Elizabeth and Andrew faced the consequences of their actions, Ellen's life continued to move forward in a positive direction. James proposed to her, expressing his desire to build a family together. Despite the wounds of her past, Ellen felt the sincerity and true love from James, a man who always showed her care and respect. They decided to marry in a small, warm ceremony surrounded only by close friends and colleagues. Their wedding was neither extravagant nor elaborate, but it was filled with genuine love and joy. Standing beside James and looking into his eyes, Ellen felt all the pain of her past dissolve. She knew that from this moment on, she was no longer alone, no longer a woman subjected to scorn and oppression. She was now a loved wife, a cherished partner, and a confident woman embracing her life. In the early days of their new life together, Ellen and James explored their shared interests, building a simple yet happy family life. Every morning, they brewed coffee, read books, and talked about their future plans. Ellen's heart was filled with peace and contentment, a feeling she had never experienced before. What made her happiest was knowing that she had escaped Elizabeth's control and found her own path. She was no longer dependent on anyone's pity but was instead a free woman living on her own terms. Her new life with James wasn't just a fresh start, it was a recovery, a declaration that she deserved happiness. As for Elizabeth, the years that followed were filled with solitude and regret. No one visited her anymore, no friends, no son who had always stood by her. Those who once respected her now remembered her only as a cruel woman, consumed by arrogance and blind possessiveness. In the end, she came to understand that everything she had done wasn't to preserve her family but to satisfy her own selfish desires. Andrew, after leaving his mother, began a journey of self-reflection. He lived alone in a small apartment, spending much of his time contemplating his mistakes. He realized that his weakness and indecisiveness had caused him to lose Ellen. Regret weighed heavily on him whenever he thought of her, but he knew he couldn't turn back time. All he could do was remind himself to live better from now on, to no longer let selfishness and weakness dictate his life. One autumn afternoon, while watching the golden leaves fall outside his window, Andrew thought back to the happy days he had spent with Ellen. But he knew she had found a new happiness, a life free of darkness and pressure. He smiled softly to himself, wishing her well despite everything. Meanwhile, Ellen was preparing for a new chapter in her life. She and James were planning trips, charity projects, and building a cozy little home together. Each passing day, she felt reborn, loved, and valued. No longer was she oppressed, scorned, or belittled. She was truly herself, a strong, free, and happy woman. Ellen's story carries a valuable lesson about inner strength and perseverance. Faced with oppression and contempt, she chose to stand up for her self-worth, leaving behind a toxic environment to seek true happiness. Her journey reminds us that no one has the right to dictate our lives except ourselves. Happiness comes when we value ourselves and are willing to walk away from harmful relationships. For Elizabeth and Andrew, they paid the price for their selfishness and lack of respect for others, a profound lesson about the consequences of one's actions in life.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.